My name is Aníbal Pérez Liñán. I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute. Welcome everyone to our second Global Democracy Conference. Today, it is a great pleasure to see friends from many places, friends and colleagues from the DC area, friends and colleagues who came from the Notre Dame campus to be here, friends and colleagues who came from all over the world to be here today, including some members of our advisory board at the Kellogg Institute and the Advisory Council at the Keough School of Global Affairs. The purpose of the Global Democracy Conference every year is to connect scholars and practitioners to address the very urgent questions about democracy that we confront today from a comparative and a global perspective. And it is for this reason in particular that it's a great honor for me to introduce the person who will open our conference today, a scholar whose work has illuminated the interplay between the history of global Catholicism and democracy from a global perspective. I am talking about John McGreevy, the Charles and Jill Fisher Provost of the University of Notre Dame. John.
Good morning. Before we do anything else, let's give a round of applause to Anibal and to Mary Gallagher, Dean of our Keough School of Global Affairs, for their leadership. Okay, it's a privilege to join you as we convene to talk about one of the most pressing issues of our time, the future of democracy around the world. As a leading global Catholic research university, Notre Dame recognizes that the health and resilience of democracy, both in the United States and globally, is not merely an academic concern. It is a moral imperative. That's the conviction that underpins our university-wide democracy initiative, a cornerstone of our strategic framework, Notre Dame 2033, and a vital force behind this event. The Democracy Initiative seeks to establish Notre Dame as a leader in the study of democracy both in the US and worldwide, but more importantly, it seeks to understand, sustain, and promote democracy to ensure that full human dignity is achieved within and beyond our nation's borders. So through the Notre Dame Democracy Initiative, we are bringing together insights from experts who study US democracy and scholars who study democracies around the world. We are advancing cutting-edge scholarship, we are convening critical conversations, and we are building bridges between research and policy. And not least, we hope on campus and beyond to form civically engaged citizens and public servants. The values that underpin democracy at its best, human dignity, justice, solidarity, the pursuit of the common good, are central to Catholic social teaching. Through the Democracy Initiative, we affirm our belief in the inherent worth of every person and the responsibility of institutions to serve everyone, most especially the marginalized. The urgency of this work is evident in headlines around the globe. You'll learn about this in the next couple of days, but the data is staggering. The level of democracy experienced by the average person in the world today has regressed to the level of 1985, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And more than 70% of the global population currently lives under autocracy, according to a 2024 report by the Varieties of Democracy Project, and that Varieties of Democracy Project was in part founded by our scholar, Michael Coppage. In this moment, marked by rising polarization, the erosion of trust in institutions, and a troubling decline in democratic norms and freedoms, American universities, and including Notre Dame, must rise to the challenge. Promoting global democracy is essential for universities to fulfill their public mission and again, to prepare the next generation to build just, resilient, and inclusive societies. Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs plays an indispensable role in translating this vision into meaningful action. It is not a new role. Some of the people in this room know that the Kellogg Institute in particular was concerned with the preservation and enhancement of democracy going back to the 1970s. As it turns out, that work is not concluded. And our interdisciplinary work in policy, research, and education exemplifies what it means to confront global challenges with both scholarly rigor and deep moral purpose. This conference, the 2 days that we will spend together, is a crucial part of that work. Thank you for being part of this important conversation. We look forward to the insights that everyone in this room will share, and the partnerships that will emerge in the days ahead. Welcome, and now on to the conference.
Thank you, John, for these words of introduction. As John mentioned, promoting the global democracy is essential to our mission as a university, and it's especially important today because we live in hard times. For more than 40 years, the Kellogg Institute has conducted comparative research on democracy, learning from this exercise of comparison. And the lessons of this comparison are today more urgent than ever, as elected leaders all over the world use their democratic credentials and their democratic legitimacy to dismantle democracy from the inside. As part of the Keough School of Global Affairs, the policy school at the University of Notre, we have created this annual conference to promote dialogue between academics and practitioners, these policymakers, judges, journalists, civil society, in order to build enduring collaborations. Every year we focus on a new theme, and the focus of this year's theme, as you know, is executive power, because executive overreach or executive aggrandizement has been a common theme in most processes of democratic erosion worldwide. Elected leaders seeking to undermine democracy expand executive power to undermine and capture independent institutions and organizations like the professional civil service, the electoral management bodies, the judiciary, the independent media, and civil society organizations. We decided on this topic in May of last year at the end of our first Global Democracy Conference, and we made two decisions. One was to have this conference in DC this year to be able to reach a broader audience, and second, to focus on the question of executive overreach. And at that time, some people said, that topic sounds very academic and there won't be much interest on this topic. And I was like, no, I think this is going to be an interesting topic. There will be some interest. And of course, the topic is relevant because all over the world, concentration of power in the executive has had dire implications for democracy. Executive overreach means the dismantling of checks and balances to favor executives that manage public affairs as a personal business. Executive overreach means arbitrary decisions that harm the rule of law, the economy, and the livelihoods of many people. Executive overreach means the creation of networks of corruption and cronyism around the presidential palace. And executive overreach ultimately means the irreversible erosion of civil liberties and political rights. So over the next couple of days, each panel will bring comparative perspectives to address the challenges of executive overreach for particular dimensions of democratic life: the electoral process, the judiciary, civil society, the public bureaucracy, the independent media. And every day after lunchtime, we will also have action labs addressing key issues from a practical perspective. Our keynotes will also share their own experience in the defense of democracy in Latin America, in Africa, and in the US. So I truly hope that this conference will improve our ability to identify anti-democratic behaviors and some effective ways to resist them, will inspire new research questions for all of us with practical implications, and will open new areas of collaboration between academics and practitioners across different countries. So before we move into our next panel of the conference, I want to make sure that I thank the many people who made this possible conference and collaborated in the organization. It's many, many people, and I won't be able to mention all of them, but I want to make sure to mention the three members of our academic committee that thought about the design of this conference, and our colleagues in the Kellogg Institute, the Keough School of Global Affairs more broadly, and some of the students who are participating in helping with this conference. Again, I will not be able to mention all of you, but I want you to know that I'm very grateful. But there are three people that in particular that I want to mention. Teresa Hanlon, who is our event czar at the Kellogg Institute. Maura Policelli, who my colleague at the Keough School, who leads this office in Washington, D.C., and Valentina Munoz, a student in our Masters of Global Affairs, who The three of them for months and months have worked to make this possible. So thank you for the work. And now to start our conference, I would like to introduce Mary Gallagher, the Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, who will start with our first panel. Mary.
Thank you, Anibal, and thank you, John, for opening the conference. This is the opening panel. This is the panel for big questions and big answers. I'm going to just briefly introduce our two panelists, and then each one will make a short presentation, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. So I'm hoping for a really vigorous and energetic conversation on democracy and executive overreach. So starting out today will be Scott Mainwaring. Scott is the Eugene and Helen Conley Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame and long affiliated with the Kellogg Institute. His research focuses on democratization, particularly in Latin America. And then second, Thomas Carothers will be speaking. Thomas is the director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And for anyone like me who's worked on democracy and the rule of law, has had an important impact on many scholars in the field. So I'm going to just move to Scott's comments, and then we will hear from Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. Following on Anibal's comments, so this is such an incredibly relevant topic in today's world, of course. This is the title of my presentation, and a couple slides are based on work with Fernando Bizarro. So this is just the outline. I'm going to talk through three things. First, why this topic is crucial in today's world. Second, what conditions put countries particularly at risk for executive takeovers. And then third, why we should care about democracy. This shows some data from Michael Koppich's great VDEM project. It shows over time the slight decline in the level of democracy around the world. It's not huge, but if you take the bottom line, which is weighted by population, it's more significant. So this indicates that some of the really big countries in the world have had a democratic deterioration over the last 20 years. And that's kind of the backdrop for why we're here today. So I'm going to define one term. I won't bore you with other terms, but what do I mean by an executive takeover? An executive takeover is a situation in which a prime minister or president who was initially freely and fairly elected degrades democracy to such a degree that it's some kind of authoritarian regime. These processes are usually incremental and gradual. And here you see the process of democratic, this again is VDEM data, the Liberal Democracy Index. You see the gradual decline in the level of democracy in 4 really big important countries around the world. I guess it's hard for you to see the graph, but it's Russia, India, Turkey, and Venezuela. I'm not going to dwell on the details, but you see that process of democratic degradation in all 4 countries was quite gradual. This is one of the typical characteristics of these of the most common type of executive takeover. So what are some of the typical steps? Anibal already alluded to them. You capture the judiciary, electoral courts, and other instances of accountability. You attack the independent press. You install loyalists inside the state. You force out independent individuals. You control the military. Coup-proofing, that's not so relevant for the US case, but coup-proofing in many countries around the world, of course, is an indispensable step in this process. And you change the rules of the game. So often, some of these autocratic leaders elected under democracies quickly convene new constitutional assemblies that expand executive power, they diminish federalism, they diminish the power of the courts and the Congress. Occasionally, you see this kind of process, an executive takeover through an autogolpe, through a self-coup. This is a picture of Alberto Fujimori, who engaged in this process in Peru in 1992. But most of these are more common and gradual. Since the end of the Cold War, this has become, as Anibal already said, by far the most common path to democratic breakdown around the world. This shows 3 leaders who engaged in Latin America, who engaged in this kind of takeover. By coding rules that I'm not going to get into, but I can discuss in Q&A, right? Since the beginning of the third wave of democratization in Latin America, there have been 7 democratic breakdowns via executive takeover, 6 of them this more gradual process, and 1 democratic breakdown by military coup, Honduras in 2009. This completely reverses historical patterns before then. It's not a new phenomenon, this phenomenon of executive takeovers and executive-led democratic erosions, but the balance has changed considerably in Latin America, since the beginning of the third wave of democratization. The picture on the left is Juan Perón, who was one of the most famous and important leaders of an executive takeover in Latin America before the beginning of the third wave in 1978. So why this change? Why do we see this shift from a predominance of breakdowns via military coup to a predominance of breakdowns by executive takeovers? I think one thing is diffusion by learning. Illiberal executives see that they can claim democratic legitimacy. And it's just, there's no clear shatter point. There's no clear rupture point that triggers a domestic and an international response. The second thing is it's much more challenging for international actors to identify a specific triggering moment. And it's harder for them to react. People at the Organization of American States the leadership was aghast when Hugo Chavez started to destroy democracy. Likewise, the European Union the leadership has always been very unhappy with what's taken place in Hungary and from 2015 to 2023 in Poland, but it's much harder for them to react than it is in cases of military coups. And finally, this is, of course, linked. The autocratization is less visible. Again, there's no clear rupture point. A great political scientist at Yale in a pretty recent article said that in Europe, democracy erodes from the right. In Latin America, the democratic breakdowns in the third wave, there have been 4 cases from the right and 3 from the left. So democracy in other parts of the world, including Latin America, the breakdowns sometimes occur from the right, but sometimes from the left. In Latin America, there have been 4 executive takeovers from the right, and these are the 4. I'm not going to, again, I don't want to bore you by getting into the details, but, and then there are, as I said, also 3 from the left. Interestingly, in Latin America, if you take an average, right, the breakdowns on the left have led to longer lasting dictatorships. I'm not saying that the breakdowns on the right are better for that reason, but they're bad in both cases, but that's something to be aware of. So when are countries at risk? What conditions put countries most at risk? One of the things that I think political scientists have understated, and here kudos to Tom Carothers, the leadership is really very fundamental. You have to have an illiberal executive at the top. When you have a highly illiberal executive at the top, be wary, right? It's not that they all are able to run over democracy, but it's a challenge for democracy consistently when you have an illiberal at the top. Even countries at fairly high levels of development can be at risk when you have an illiberal at the top. And these are 3 examples. Venezuela was a wealthy country. Hungary by far shatters. Some of you have read Adam Przeworski et al.'s great 2000 book, in which he argued that the country in the world with the highest level of development that experienced a democratic breakdown was Argentina in 1976. Hungary, before Viktor Orban took over in 2010, by far shattered Argentina's level of development. So one of the questions in this section of the program was, do institutions protect democracy? And the answer is yes, but, right? This graph, basically the idea is that, you know, if illiberal presidents or prime ministers have a congressional majority, democracy is more at risk. So congressional oppositions help. Institutions do matter. The second one is about stronger institutions of accountability. They too make a difference. Executive takeovers are less common in contexts of strong institutions. And interestingly, you know, people have talked a lot, and Jennifer McCoy has really been a pioneer on this topic about polarization. For the Latin American cases, prior polarization does not predict executive takeovers. What you see instead is that the illiberals who win polarize. So you end up with highly polarized contexts, but you don't start off that way. These are some other factors that have no association with democratic breakdowns via executive takeover. One of the questions that Mary Gallagher, our great dean, put to us was, you know, can democracies recover? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Poland since 2023 is an example. I have here a few Latin American examples. Most of these are cases of recovery to fairly mediocre levels of democracy. The Brazilian and Peruvian cases are partial exceptions. So one thing to note, however, is that all of these cases of democratic recovery, except Fujimori in Peru in 1992, did not lead to highly closed authoritarian regimes. So it looks, you know, it's based on few observations, but it looks like democratic recovery is quite a bit harder if you have a full breakdown to an extremely repressive authoritarian regime. The Fujimori full breakdown also was quite short-lived from 1992 to 95. So this is one of my last slides. I mean, I think it's, you know, something that we really have to talk a lot about in the world today. Those of us who study democracy, democratic practitioners, citizens, universities, right? Why democracy matters. It matters for a lot of reasons. I think first and foremost, human dignity, human rights, rule of law, these very fundamentals that are baked into the definition of democracy. But we also know from a huge amount of research that democracies promote more economic growth. Democracies promote much better healthcare across a wide array of indicators. And the last thing I'll mention is that a democratic world is also a much more peaceful world. This is all based on unassailable, all of this, you know, the evidence is always shifting and debated, but very, very clear social science evidence. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, this opening panel raises a lot of questions that we'll look at through the rest of the conference, and questions that we'll be thinking about across the next many years of our lives. How can we bolster democracy? How can we avoid electing illiberal executives? How can we fight back against these illiberal executives? And then how do we recover democracy? How can we deepen democracy, right? This is a really important question in an extremely difficult environment. And then this comes in, Applebaum wrote an article recently in The Atlantic called "Democracy is Losing the Propaganda War." I think she's exactly right. And we have to start figuring out how we can win the propaganda war. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak with you all, and I salute the Kellogg School and the Kellogg Institute for stepping up on the issue of democracy at this moment. We need that. We need it from every organization that's concerned, every individual that's concerned, and that's why I think a lot of you are here today. At this conference, each of the different panels is going to explore different elements of executive overreach. So what I'd like to do in my just brief opening remarks is frame the topic for us a bit, just to help position each of the panel discussions in a larger framework of understanding. Let me start by returning to the question that Scott opened with, which was, in a sense, why this topic now? Why is executive overreach, why has it become the topic of the day in the field of democracy? That's actually a two-part question. The first part is why executive overreach and not other forms of democratic breakdown? And the second is, why is there so much of it? On the first topic, why executive overreach, I'd say the following. It sounds a little bit confusing, I think, when I state it. Executive overreach is the characteristic chronic illness of a democratic age. What do I mean by that? Prior to the end of the Cold War, prior to the start of the third wave of democracy, democracy was caught in 50 years from the 1930s through the late 1980s of ideological struggle between contending ideologies from the right, from the left, and from other sources. And during those years, democracies broke down because regimes of the right were fighting for a certain kind of legitimacy, and military takeovers were not just odd interruptions, but often the capturing of the system by a military that claimed a certain right to run the country in its own ways. Democracies broke down from the left, from armed struggle in some cases, by people who felt they were fighting for a different kind of justice that was going to be achieved by socialism or communism, and they tore apart democracies from that direction. Or in some cases, one-party regimes in Africa after the end of decolonization that didn't have a particular ideological coloring except a kind of nationalism and unitary nationalism. But once the third wave hit, democracy became the normative framework for the world, and those other forms of democratic breakdown lost their claims to legitimacy and became to be seen to be odd eruptions from a past time. So when there's a military coup now, it has almost a sense of nostalgia about it, about this is what people used to do, and people don't actually claim legitimacy very much for the military rule. They usually portray it as a temporary interruption. And so executive overreach is how democracies break down when democracy is the rules of the game. Because executive overreach is usually carried out by parties and politicians who claim that they're saving democracy. If you look at the language of people who've come into power and then taken apart democracy, typically they say, I was elected to save democracy, but to do it, I have to break some dishes. Mm-hmm. And watch me break some dishes, but watch me save democracy. They don't end up saving democracy, but they talk a democratic language and they act that way. And they're a democratic illness of a democratic age. So we have to understand that executive overreach is the core problem of the democratic age, because the other problems of contending ideologies have largely faded into the past. Now, why is there so much of it in the last 20, 25 years? This conference is actually not about the why question, and there have been plenty of meetings and workshops and conferences on that topic. But let me just sum up at least my own particular view, which is actually a kind of particular view. But I view it as if you ask, why are all these countries experiencing something rather similar, this executive overreach? There's a tendency to look for sort of magic bullet explanations and think it must be about polarization, which is a big problem, or it must be about populism, or maybe it's technology's fault. There must be some explanation, because why is Bangladesh experiencing the same thing as Bolivia did 10 or 15 years ago, and so forth? I think the search for those kind of explanations is often mixing up causes and effects and symptoms and illness. And I think it's a simpler story. I think it's the following. After the end of the Cold War, we launched into 15 to 20 years of very rapid movement towards democracy, which produced an international landscape in which there were somewhere around 100 countries which had the following characteristics. They had rushed into pluralism, rushed in a good sense. Citizens have said, I want a voice. I want to have a chance to elect my leaders. They rushed into pluralism, yet they had very weak institutions. They had not built up the rule of law. Their institutions of horizontal accountability were fledgling in many cases. They had not built up civil societies very much, or civil societies had mushroomed with very weak roots. The press was weak and so forth. So you had a lot of pluralism, which meant anybody could enter the political scene in contexts with fairly weak institutions, and also in contexts in which there's a lot of citizen unhappiness, because a lot of these countries were struggling in a lot of ways, and citizens felt, hey, the economic situation is lousy in my country, and I was hoping democracy could make it better. The human security situation is lousy in my country, and I was hoping democracy could make it better. There's a lot of corruption in this country. So imagine this thought experiment. You take 100 countries, you open it up, the political process, to pluralism, which means any political actor, no matter how predatory, can throw their hat in the ring. The countervailing institutions are very weak in most of them. Citizens are very unhappy in most cases and open to messages of disruption and the need for radical change. Bingo, you have a lot of executive overreach because you have produced a situation in which there are a lot of countries that are very ripe for it. So there's been a sense in the last 10 years of puzzlement, like, I can't understand why this is happening everywhere. It's not that puzzling. It was expected. And it was something that we should realize is it's not part of some means that there's a teleological answer that we're going to get there in the end, but it's not that surprising analytically because the conditions were created over the last 20 or 30 years to lead us to this moment. Now, you'll notice when I describe countries that are vulnerable to executive overreach, it doesn't fit the United States very well. Pluralism isn't new here. We do have strong countervailing institutions. Citizens are actually not so bad off compared to citizens in many other parts of the world. So we'll come back probably in other parts of the conference, and I'll touch on it later, to why the United States is quite an outlier when it comes to executive overreach compared to most of the other countries that are experiencing it in terms of those conditions. Third question I wanted to address is all executive overreach basically the same? At some level, the way it's been defined today, which is a good way to define it, I think, means, in a sense, by definition, it's all kind of the same, or we wouldn't call it executive overreach. And there is a lot of similarity, and leaders who engage in it do learn from each other. There is a kind of executive overreach, or what people are calling autocratic playbook, in which it's very familiar. I won't go through the elements. They've already been mentioned today. And so at one level, yes, it's very similar. But I think it's important, and scholars are really just starting to delve into it, to see that it does vary significantly on some dimensions. And one can attempt analytic studies that create sort of clusters around these dimensions. But in some cases, that's helpful. In some cases, it's not. But it gets us to think, I think, more deeply about some of the differences among the cases. I'll mention 3 dimensions. The first is simply what elements of the menu are most emphasized. Here's the autocratic playbook. Leader X comes in and says, well, let's see, how am I going to increase my power? Some leaders go right after the political opposition, hard, put that political opponent in jail, outlaw the main opposition party, try to smash the political opposition. In some cases, that's the approach. Others don't have that power or don't want to do it that way, go after what's often the main constraint, which is the judiciary, because rule of law is a major constraint. So they think, how can I undermine this judiciary structure, like in Poland that was carried out, or that could be possibly being carried out in Mexico? We'll see how that goes. They go after the judiciary. Others are very concerned about the electoral process and feel that it's undermining them. Bolsonaro was constantly attacking, creating fears around the electoral process. So different leaders choose different parts of the menu, and there are different styles. There's those who go directly after the opposition, those who go after the institutions of horizontal accountability, those who end up focusing on the electoral process or civil society. So we can start to identify different, I would say, styles or choices that are made. And that's one important dimension of variability. The second is severity. There's a really wide scale between fairly mild executive overreach to terminal executive overreach. Now, these aren't really clearly identified subtypes, but the difference between where Bolsonaro brought Brazil by 2022 is very different to where Daniel Ortega brought his country across a similar period. And so you have relatively mild executive overreach, which is characterized by certain limits. Certain institutions do hold. In Brazil, the judiciary held, civil society held and responded, and so forth. When it's terminal, the institutions are breaking. They're being suffocated. Ortega comes down very hard on protesters to try to just smash civil society with violence, undermines political opposition, and so forth. And so you have, one could call it, mild executive overreach, and you can have severe or even terminal meaning that leads to the extinction of democracy, like, say, Belarus. A third dimension is, and Scott mentioned this, is the ideological type, which is that executive overreach is carried out for the sake of different projects, ideological projects. In some cases, it's a project of the left, like what's been happening in Mexico, at least potentially in recent years, in which there's a style in which executive overreach is colored by concepts of economic populism from the left, as well as other ideas about distribution of resources and so forth. And there's a kind of a leftist style of executive overreach, and then of course sometimes it's carried out from the right, which tends to have more of a nationalistic, nativism, exclusive, majoritarian quality to it in some cases. And so one can see ideological styles, but there's a third category. They always hold up these cards here and they never say, "I love this, keep talking for a long time." They always say something very different, which is, "Shut up soon." Okay, so there are different ideological types. So 3 dimensions. But I want to save us, so 3 dimensions of the choice of menus, the degree of severity, and the ideological type or the cause. But I want to close then by talking about executive overreach in the United States. What are its characteristics? I would describe executive overreach so far, since January 20th, as occurring at 3 different levels, and it's important to see the integration of the project. The first level is within the executive branch. We have a president who, and some people around him, who believe the president should reign supreme over the executive branch, as opposed to the executive being one part of executive power, instead the unitary executive theory. And so what this means is you have to politically weaken and tame the civil service. You have to gut the institutions of independent accountability, like inspectors general. You have to undercut other forms of accountability institutions like independent agencies and so forth, and fire the heads of them. And the military, part of the executive branch, has to be more politically tamed and influenced and even controlled in certain ways. So the first leg of the executive overreach in the United States is the attempt to make the president a supreme executive. The second part is then you go after the horizontal accountability, which means primarily you're in Article 2 power, you have to go after Article 1 and Article 3. Here we've seen primarily the attack on the judiciary through when courts produce a ruling you don't like, you don't just say, "I regret that," you say that judge is wrong and should be impeached, or I'm going to ignore that ruling, or I'm going to question the right or legitimacy of the court to question my actions, so forth. So you attack judicial restraint on executive power, and you try to sideline Congress, the power of the purse, which is so important. Essentially, you see an executive trying to take the power of the purse away from Congress by sidelining it, and doing things that normally would be the power of the Congress to either spend funds or not spend funds, and so forth. And then the third leg of the executive overreach, you have supreme executive. Secondly, you have the attempt to take over horizontal accountability in your favor. And then third, vertical accountability. You go after opposition voices, the press, in this case, universities, lawyers who might sue you, civic organizations that you don't like, and in general, people who speak up against you. You try to show the power of the executive to punish them in some way. And so it's an integrated project, quite resembling that of executive overreach in other countries, except the United States has this particular character, and I'll end with this, which is that this is the first time we've really seen executive overreach, a project of serious executive overreach, taking place in a sustained fashion, or what looks like will be a sustained fashion, in a country which is a, quote, wealthy established democracy, which has had countervailing institutions for a long time, which has had traditions of horizontal accountability for a long time. Of course, there were cases, Scott mentioned Hungary, that had exceeded a certain income level, but it was still a relatively recent democratic experience in Hungary compared to the United States. So the United States, we're here today in the midst of what political scientists would love to say is an amazing natural experiment, but those who are living through it don't find it quite so enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. Those were very invigorating comments. As some of you know, I'm a political scientist who studies China, which is not a democracy. I want to bring something up as a question to both Tom and Scott about the moment that we're in. And I was saying to somebody earlier this morning that I write a column every other week that I wrote yesterday, and then the tariff deal came out overnight, and I have to rewrite my column. I don't want to suggest that everything has to do with US-China competition, but I do feel like we're in a moment, and have been in this moment for quite some time, where there's a sort of fundamental change in the balance of power globally, both economically, politically, militarily, and even things like what Xi Jinping calls discourse power, which is about the propaganda war. And it seems to me one of the things that is happening between these two superpowers is we're at a moment where there is an intention to decouple and kind of separate these two entangled economies as a way for both to move towards some sort of reform of their domestic systems, which both dramatically need. I mean, there are different problems in the countries, although they're related, China and the United States, and that kind of fundamental sort of institutional problem, which are domestic problems really for both countries, is so difficult that it seems to be creating a certain amount of inability to actually move on reform. And so China has been talking about changing its development model for the last 10 years, very unsuccessfully. The United States has been talking about various things related to bringing manufacturing back, reducing the deficit, and things like that. Neither have been able to really do these things. And so this problem between the US and China have resulted in both countries, so this is a little bit different than what Tom is talking about, both countries have become dominated by strongmen. Trump in the case of the United States, Xi Jinping in the case of China, because of this, I think, desire to, we need to change the institutions to address these problems that we have domestically. So in a sense, what I'm arguing for is that when we talk about democratic backsliding, we're talking about the destruction of democratic institutions. But we could maybe also make a more general argument that there is kind of institutional breakdown in many places around the world, including many autocracies like China. And so when you think about what he did when Xi Jinping took office, removing term limits, sort of reducing the strength of civil society, reducing the strength of the judiciary, bringing to heel the private sector, I see the attacks somewhat similar. So you can both have democratic backsliding and maybe autocratic backsliding at the same time, but it's a kind of institutional decay in both places. So I guess the question then is something else going on more broadly around the world where we see the rise of strongmen politics in both democracies and autocracies?
Well, it's a really fascinating question. I don't have a clear answer, but let me hazard a partial answer, and that is that China's rise and Russia's aggressiveness under Putin really changed the global scene for democracy. It made it much easier for would-be autocrats in the global South to not pay attention to the European Union and the United States. I don't want to listen to you, the United States or the European Union, and I don't have to, because I can turn to China for trade and investment. And I think that is a really important component of what's going on in the last 20 years. it was harder to do that. There was a short period of democratic hegemony at the ideological level around the world that spanned roughly 1990 to roughly 2005. The end point is less clear because the end point, I think, is China's rise as a great global power. But let's date it as approximately 2005. I just think that global context makes it a lot easier for autocrats to get elected and to win power. One other thing that we haven't talked about, but I think is also really fundamental here, is the rise of social media and how easy it makes it for autocrats to get, and would-be autocrats to disseminate false information. Authoritarians have always used false information. That's not new, but the ease with which you can use false information, disseminate false information through social media is astonishing. So I do think you're right, Mary. I mean, certainly most of Western Europe has been sclerotic in the last 20 years or so. I don't know. However, in that respect, too, the United States is a bit odd because our economy has done well since the end of the pandemic. And if you take the last 20 years, even though there's been an increase in inequality in the US, it's also true that our economy has been somewhat dynamic. So are institutions eroding? Yes, but I think it's also partially the existence of the authoritarian alternatives and the existence of social media, which has helped tremendously. It's helped discredit existing institutions.
Thank you.
A couple of things. Let me state an unclear answer as clearly as I can. I think that you sounded like you were suggesting a bit, Mary, but maybe that was just you were leaning that way, but not really saying it, that the project here by the current administration that entails executive overreach is related in some ways to the need of the United States to compete with a powerful and growingly economically powerful, at least China. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think this project has its own roots, and it's compatible with both a softer and a harder line towards China. I don't think it really needs China as a rival to justify itself. I think it has internal roots, which are much more powerful. And secondly, the term of institutional breakdown that you described, it kind of implies the institutions broke down, so the autocrats had to fill the space. Putin broke the institutions. He smashed them. He snapped them in half. He crushed them. Xi has done the same in terms of, limits on his power and so forth. This is the autocratizing logic in which it, never meet a constraint that you don't want to smash. And so I see it more as the process in Russia and China is just ambitious leaders who are driven by projects. Putin has a rather grandiose project of national power expansion, which requires him to act aggressively outside his borders, but then also to, stifle any dissent to that project at home. Xi seems to have his own version of a national power project that also, in his logic, requires him to suppress things. So institutional breakdown that people talk about in the West of, democracy is in trouble because Western institutions aren't performing very well, that's a different kind of problem or issue than what I think those countries are experiencing. So I'd be careful about equating it. Now, it is certainly the case, I didn't mention that in the landscape that I described of 100 countries that have the characteristics that I described, an additional feature of that landscape are some friends available to you. So if you're Daniel Ortega and you start taking your country down a road that, horrifies people in the United States and Europe politically, you have some other friends that you can go to for diplomatic and economic support and military support and so forth. So having these other friends out there is useful for the autocratic playbook because it allows you to get support that you wouldn't have gotten in a landscape where such friends didn't exist. So they're a facilitating factor. But most of these projects of executive overreach are quite domestic. What Modi is doing in India, what Erdogan has been doing in Turkey, what Orban has been doing in Hungary and so forth, probably would have been happening whether or not Russia was up or down and China was up or down in different ways over the last 20 years. They have their own domestic logic and their own domestic drivers.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to go down a China rabbit hole right now. I do find when I'm thinking about particularly the United States and the political party shifts that we see, particularly around right now with the trade war, where the GOP, which has traditionally been the party of free trade, is now much more protectionist and seems to be going in a quite severe direction regarding protectionism. And then this morning in the New York Times, Senator Josh Hawley has a op-ed around keeping Medicaid, and one of the lines that really struck me was, if the GOP wants to become a working class party. And I thought, oh, okay, well, and the title is something about an identity crisis in the Republican Party. So I think there are these institutional shifts that are so destabilizing that creates, I think, a desire, at least among some within the party, for consolidation of power around a single leader. But I want to just one more question about autocracy, and maybe then move on to some of the lessons that we can learn from some of the places that have been able to successfully restore democracy. But just on this question of admiration for autocracy, we had Daniel Allen at Notre Dame a few months ago. She talked a lot about what she sees, particularly in the tech world, around admiration for the restoration of some sort of monarchical system. And we see it in public opinion, sort of disaffection with democracy. And then we see what China talks about in its own propaganda about the ways in which democratic systems don't function well. Why is that so appealing now? Is it not about this example of a successful autocracy that is economically just as competitive as the United States in some fields? Is it something else that's more domestic that you seem to be suggesting? But why are we in this moment now where there's a lot of people from elites all the way down to the working class who we might call autocracy curious?
Are you asking about the United States or more generally, Mary?
I think you could. I'm asking about the United States, but I'd love to hear other examples too, if you think it's.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I have a vivid memory in 1992. I was in Romania, in rural Romania, with the National Democratic Institute doing some election observing, and I was traveling with the Chilean political scientist. The two of us were going around. He was a Chilean Democrat. And he was horrified to discover that it seemed like every conversation we had with Romanians, who you wouldn't think would be well informed about South American politics, kept asking him and saying, how do we get a Pinochet here? We want that so much. Because they'd experienced 2.5 years of democracy and they didn't like it. It was chaotic. Prices were going up, corruption was there. It seemed like a mess. And they'd heard about this guy. And my Chilean friend was, his head was exploding. He kept telling them about democracy, and he was saying, you don't want this, and they said, no, we do. Humans want order. And when democracy produces chaos and disruption and flux, people crave for order. And we live in an age in which order is under threat in very complex ways. Mm-hmm. Countries feel challenged by an international landscape that's extremely competitive. They feel the flux in many countries of movement of peoples that unsettles some people. They feel technology disrupting their lives. People crave for order in every age, but every age has its challenges to order, both at the national level and at the personal level. And we live in an age with a lot of new disruptive elements that are troubling for people. And so the quest for order is then allied with the quest for self-certainty of leadership and sort of acting in a dominant fashion. When people want order, they want to see a leader who sounds like they're in charge. Says, I got the answer. Don't worry, I'm in charge. Current president of the United States says he rules the world. That's an assertion of dominance and of order. And so I don't think the quest for order is really that different, or the strongman temptation, which political scientists have written about for generations. But I think we have new dimensions of insecurity and disorder that are sparking it, combined with, as you say, Scott, very correctly, that social media is creating, is intensifying the personalism of politics, because we're living in a world of influencers in which politicians are just another form of influencer. And everybody has fans now rather than citizens, and people sign on to projects, whether it's, you know, I want to dress like this, or I want a leader who talks like that. And people have a tremendous personalization of attaching their emotions to individuals that they see rather than to larger ideological projects, or rather to social movements or this or that. They're living in a world dotted with these very influential individuals. And so the hyper-personalization of politics, associated with technology, connects up to this quest for order and leads us to a lot of autocratic craving.
Thank you.
I would echo Tom on one point. The United States is an extreme outlier, right? I mean, there's no other, and this might change in the coming years, but so far there's been no other country with such a long history of democracy and such a high level of wealth that has faced a severe problem of autocratization from the executive. I think that in the US, right, I'm not sure I have any original wisdom to add to the conversation, but cultural change that many people did not like, economic stagnation, not at the aggregate level, but in terms of working class wages, right? These are difficult challenges for people. I mentioned to someone last night that when I was an undergraduate, I worked 2 summers at Bethlehem Steel, which was at that time one of the biggest corporations in the world. It doesn't exist anymore. The second summer, I worked in a machine shop with a lot of skilled workers, and they were making, by today, if you adjust to real wages, some of those guys made upwards of $200,000 a year, even $250,000 a year. That doesn't exist anymore. So, and as I said, Bethlehem Steel doesn't exist anymore. So that was a really very significant displacement of a disruption of people's lives. I don't think it's only about material issues. I don't think it's only about cultural issues, but I think in the US, both of these have generated a vortex in which, there's a lot of democratic disaffection, and even more than the autocratic curious. I think a huge problem is one that Milan Sfola called attention to, and that is most voters just do not highly value democracy. And that's true even among Democrats, according to his research. I agree with Tom that, if we turn our attention away from the United States and think about places like El Salvador, right, which is a dramatic case. I mean, there, the semi-democratic governments really did not deliver in a big way, right? You had the highest homicide rates in the world for a considerable time. When public security severely breaks down, it's easy for an autocratic leader to come along and say, I can fix that. Yeah, we'll throw a huge number of people in jail, but I can fix that. And I think, that trade-off is why 85% of Salvadoran citizens voted to re-elect Bukele, I think it was last year or 2023. So it's no wonder when things go seriously wrong that autocrats who proclaim that they can fix everything will get a hearing.
Great. Thank you so much. Before we move on to the audience, I wanted to ask a question about, we talked a little bit earlier when we met on, I think it was you, Scott, who said you don't like the term constitutional crisis because you think about this more as a process of democratic backsliding, and there isn't one moment, right, in time where you go from okay to not okay. And a lot of the things that we're talking about right now are really long-term historical trends, economic stagnation or cultural shifts. When we think about the process of democratic backsliding, and you think about cases where it has been successfully stopped, like you mentioned Poland, what are the things that you've seen in your research that seem to indicate this is what you can do, as opposed to these are sort of broader trends that are very, very difficult to arrest?
Yes, it's a great question. And I don't have much expertise on this topic, but let me just note a couple of things. One is you always contest every election, right? I mean, the Venezuelans learned at high cost that boycotting an election, a national congressional election, was a terrible idea. And something else, this is something I learned from Laura Gamboa. I think that maximalist opposition strategies, oh yeah, let's try a coup, right? To overthrow. I mean, there could be that temptation. It looks as if you don't act now, you might never have a chance. But those maximalist strategies can lead to massive purges of the military. They can lead to massive purges of the opposition. Turkey in 2015 or 2016 was a leading example of this. I think, hundreds of thousands of people lost public sector jobs. There was a tremendous purge of the military. And I think also, the idea of contesting every space. It's not just civil society. It's not just political parties. It's not just a vibrant press. They don't have to all come together as one organic whole. That's not going to happen. But I think using the multiplicity of voices is really important.
How about you, Tom?
There are starting to emerge a number of cases where people who've engaged in executive overreach have hit a wall and lost an election and been replaced. Bangladesh didn't lose an election there, or they stole an election, but then they paid a price for it by losing power. But then other cases, Poland in recent years, Brazil, obviously, some cases in Africa like Zambia in 2021 and Senegal last year. So there is starting to emerge a bit of a case set of countries like that. I just published a paper with my colleague Mackenzie Carrier, who's here today, on this. And there's no, again, sort of magic bullet of how do you defeat them, because if there were, Erdogan still wouldn't be in power, and nor would Viktor Orban or a number of others. A lot of these leaders are quite successful in maintaining power for a long time, and in some cases carrying out a terminal project. But those who have lost, there are certain characteristics. One is the heart of it is, no surprise, it's concerted political opposition, usually connected with civic opposition, that has the characteristic of being, coalition-oriented. My colleague Jennifer McCoy has done some great work on the importance of coalitions in these kinds of situations, broad-based coalitions that cut across the usual political divides. In some cases, what's interesting, in some cases like Poland and Brazil, the opposition coalitions use the democracy issue, because in those cases it was effective, and they learned to make the most of it. The democracy issue in the sense of saying to citizens, if you want to save democracy, you got to get this person or this party out of power. In the United States, there was a big debate last year about how useful would democracy itself be on the US ballot, and that's interesting. In the United States, I'd say, fell somewhere differently on that spectrum. So first and foremost, it's like saying, no surprise, is implication of what Scott's saying is it's up to political opposition to be effective, to fight under usually very difficult circumstances in civil society, to organize as broadly as possible, when possible, to connect with political opposition, or to do it on its own. Brazil's civic coalition was extremely important in standing up to Bolsonaro. But then, you say, well, what about the courts? Courts actually seem to be less common, the pivotal institution that stopped it. Brazil was unusual in the importance of the courts in Brazil. In Poland, they had managed to undermine the courts to some degree, and in some other cases, they had also done that, although courts also played a role in Senegal as well. So courts, of course, are there, but there's no substitute for broad-based, tough, effective opposition in such cases. And one could go further into a sort of a resistance or a autocratic unraveling playbook. The other thing I would say is once you beat the the person who is engaged in executive overreach, it's only the start. That's just the start of the struggle. What's been the experience in those countries since those leaders lost power is just continual political struggle. If you get into the Polish politics of the last year and a half or so, it's just been, a day-to-day combat between the old forces and the new forces. Often the old forces still have different, sources of power. In the case of Poland, they still hold the presidency. In other cases, they still have a legislative majority and so forth. And so it isn't as though the sun comes out and then you're on the road to democracy again. You've just started the battle. And then the final thing about that new period that's very important is that the new leaders come in feeling like, I'm here to save democracy. My election is a symbol of that. And they hope they're going to get a lot of political credit for that. The next day, the voters saying, so what did you do for me today? And they need to produce. They need to, whatever it is, whether it's human security or economic marginalization or corruption, they need to start producing results. And so they don't get a lot of political capital out of trying to save democracy, much less than they usually think they will.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and that reminds me of South Korea, which we didn't talk about, but South Korea is another example where they've successfully fought off, successfully impeached a president and then fought off a coup, but is continuing to really struggle and has a lot of political polarization. So I think the lesson from both of your answers is that in order to stop democratic backsliding, you double down on democracy, right? You contest elections, you form coalitions. Which is a good lesson, but also a lesson that requires a lot of hard work and attention. I want to open it up to questions, and we do have a mic going around. It would be great when you ask a question if you could also say who you are and what you do. In the back. Sorry, there's lots of hands. Yep, right there.
Stanley Kober. We've been talking about democracy, but it seems to me the more fundamental problem is the rule of law. A few days ago, Vice President Vance referenced the statement attributed to Andrew Jackson. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The implication being that decisions by the courts would not be obeyed. This, to me, is fundamental. We're seeing this now with habeas corpus. And I'd like to ask the panelists to address that question. This seems to me to go beyond democracy to the foundations. The rule of law is our protection.
Tom, you've written a lot about rule of law.
Yeah. Stanley, I think that, yes, of course. But the rule of law in our country is part of a democratic constitution. It's not an independent thing outside of our democratic system. It's fully integrated into democracy. And countries that don't have the rule of law are not democracies. And democracies where the rule of law is struggling are weakened and compromised democracies. So I don't really like to separate them quite so much. I just see them as deeply integrated. And so when I talked about the executive overreach playbook, reaching across to the courts, what I mean is an attack on the rule of law as one of the core constraints on power, but it's only one of the constraints of power. It's in some ways very fundamental to our constitutional order, but popular constraints on through elections are also fundamental. So I just can't quite separate them enough to say, all we need is this. We do need that, but we need, a broader constitutional system which has a number of features that are fundamental to democracy, like the Bill of Rights and other things.
Scott, do you want to add anything?
I completely agree with that response. To me, a set of rights and a set of accountability institutions that function are defining features of democracy. I don't think they're separable.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Mason Ingram with PACT. Two quick questions, which is one of the distinguishing features you indicated about many of where we've seen authoritarians rising has been the slow process at which it has taken place. It seems like potentially one of the distinguishing features of what we're seeing in the US is something that's much quicker. Would you agree with that, or would you set the clock back in terms of the democratic erosion and increasing authoritarian tendencies, at least what's happened within parties as happening earlier? Secondly, what do you see as the risks or perhaps opportunities of a much quicker effort at autocratic breakthrough, and both in terms of potentially galvanizing opposition in ways that may be more difficult when the process is much more gradual? Thank you.
The United States lives its life as a country on the stage of the world, and it's like a theater performance for the world in a way. And what's happening here in the United States is so exposed in terms of everybody scrutinizing every day the actions that we sort of have to ask, is it just so much more scrutinized than what was happening in, say, Hungary in second half of 2010 and 2011 after Fidesz returned to power then, or in some other cases like Poland after PIS came into power. So in a way, it's just, part of it is in the United States, every little thing is scrutinized. But nevertheless, and in some cases, it did go relatively fast in other places, but people were paying a lot less attention, so they didn't see some fundamental things that were happening. But in other cases, it has been much more iterative. Erdogan is a much slower case. It took Erdogan a long time to do all the things that he did. So I think the United States is unusual. We were talking last night at a dinner here with some of the participants about the U.S. has unusually high state capacity compared to many countries that have engaged in executive overreach. So you've got, they burst on the scene, issue 100 executive orders right away, so forth. It's a well-staffed government in the sense, and they can do a lot quickly because the United States has fairly high state capacity compared to some other places. But this is also a bit unusual in that you have a case of a person who came to power with a lot of these intentions, ruled for a while, lost power, and came back in. So this second wave executive overreach style of this administration is striking. They had really prepared much more than most places where it occurs. The person manages to get into power and they've never been in this situation before. As these people, second time around, it's that. So I think that's a characteristic of what's happening here too. Yes, I think it does present opportunities in a sense as we're presented with the project right away, and there's no question about it. It's like, okay, there it is, 100 days staring you in the face. Whereas there was a tendency to underestimate the process in other countries. There was a tendency to minimize what was happening, to say, well, there is a debate about whether the Constitution says this or that, or yeah, they closed this one newspaper, but there's still some press. There was a tendency I saw in a lot of other places to underestimate what was happening, where when it's presented this way, it's easier to come to terms with it, and I think it's clarifying to the mind. It should be, and therefore clarifying to action. So I think it's a riskier strategy to do it this way. But this is an administration that is quite has a high appetite for risk in all dimensions. I don't mean that pejoratively. It's risk can be good in leadership. Look at Winston Churchill in 1940. I mean, great leaders sometimes take enormous risks in how he could have capitulated to the Germans. He took a risk and said, "We're going to win," at a time when people thought he was smoking something. So risk is not per se a good thing or bad thing, but this is an administration with a high appetite for risk, and so people are on notice.
My take on that is uncertain. I completely agree with Tom that these processes of autocratization are multidimensional. Leaders attack different ways at different paces. And so I think it's true that the Trump administration has been very visible, very open, very quickly about attacking some democratic rights. Is it faster, if we could scale everything to one score, is it faster than most other cases? That's where I'm a little bit uncertain. For example, just weeks after he came to office in early 1999, Hugo Chavez announced that he was going to hold a new constitutional assembly. He wrote the rules for electing that constitutional assembly. They stacked the game in his favor. He won 93% of seats with 53% of the vote. And then the new constitution greatly expanded executive power, diminished congressional power, diminished the power of federalism. So that was incredibly fast and incredibly important, right? I would say on balance, that my judgment would be on balance that was a faster process than what has happened in the US. And I would say the same about Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who did exactly the same thing. Almost immediately after taking office, said, we're going to have a new constitution. When you can dramatically change the rules of the game, that is huge. It's not the only thing that you have to do, but it's huge.
Thank you. My name is Obi Ezekwesili, and I have the privilege of being the third, one of the three keynote speakers at this conference. I want to say that political freedom, which is the basis of democracy, and the economic freedom it offers, is one that nobody should take for granted. And I feel like something happened with the United States of America where you took it for granted. And I'm just curious as to where you think the tipping point would be before you actually add the United States to the list of the countries that you presented to us earlier, Tom. No, not Tom, Scott. Yes, Scott. So that's number one. Number two is, it was your own former president, Thomas Jefferson, that said that eternal vigilance is the price you pay for liberty. When would the middle class Americans take responsibility for the fact that they became alienated from democracy and basically laid the pathway for a lot of what we see in terms of your democracy, making those of us that love democracy be mocked by those who don't like democracy, where we come from?
Well, I don't know when the American middle class and elite will awaken from the slumber, from the great slumber. I hope it's soon. And on that particular point, this is just all anecdotal, but we hear grumblings from some business leaders who thought, Trump says he's going to have high tariffs, but we don't really believe it. He's too smart to do that. Well, now we do have high tariffs. My point, I guess, is that it should not hinge on this. It absolutely should not hinge on this, but probably for the US case, what happens with the economy in the next 2 years and the next 4 years will significantly affect how people vote in 2026 and 2028. Again, that should not be the case. The cases that I know of that have had huge democratic shocks in which people and elites got really committed to democracy, these are cases typically after bad dictatorships that fail in every way, right? We don't want it to come to that. The price for that is extremely high. But you're right. I mean, if we look at a lot of public survey indicators in the US and behavior, right, it seems evident that that most people in the United States do not heavily value democracy today. I don't really know, beyond the short-term economy, what it's going to take to restore that.
Thank you, and I'm glad you're here with us for the conference. Look forward to your remarks. part of the problem with the style of executive overreach that they're carrying out is it's very multifaceted, as I mentioned, the 3 levels, and almost all of them are relatively gradualistic, and so there aren't really the very bright red lines that occur with like the rewriting of the Constitution, or we're replacing the Electoral Commission with a different body, things where you could say, you know, that is the breaking of a fundamental institution in some way. So instead, you have a lot of cuts and a lot of blood, but you don't have the jugular, you know. And so I think when people look at, and there's a continual relaxation of the red lines. People say, well, they did that, but that was an undocumented immigrant, and so it wasn't a U.S. citizen, so it's different. Oh, that was a person who had a green card. Yeah, but that's not the same as, you know, there's a lot of sort of step-by-step thinking about, well, they said this towards the university, they could have said more, or they did do that. But, you know, there's every area where there's action, there's debate about around it. And one can think of certain kinds of red lines, like using the U.S. military against U.S. citizens. But then you sort of think, well, wait a minute. Eisenhower called out the 82nd Airborne in Arkansas in the 1950s to enforce a desegregation order, so he used the military. So is that a red line per se? Well, then it's what do they use the military for? Whether use it to police the southern border, is that a red line, and so forth. You could say attacking the electoral machinery. They say, well, we just are trying to get voter ID, you know, more secure, and that's not really an attack on the electoral machinery. Of course, that may affect certain kinds of state elections in certain ways. So it's surprisingly hard to find the kind of crisp and clear red lines where we say, that's it. VDEM has now moved us from category X to Y. We're all waiting for that moment. But, you know, it's surprisingly difficult in this kind of process, precisely because, unlike a case like Ecuador or Venezuela that you mentioned, Scott, is because the United States has fairly strong traditions, laws, norms, procedures, it's hard to do any one big dramatic thing because there is actually a lot of resistance and there is a lot of law and so forth. And so they proceed in a declarative and then iterative fashion rather than a dramatic institutional breaking fashion.
So the person in the back who's, right there? Yep. He's had his hand up for quite a while.
Okay, thank you.
And then, okay. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Nevin Kamath. I'm the campaign director of an anti-authoritarian advocacy campaign known as Resist Trump Campaign. We're based in Austin, and we are running Tesla takedown protests for the last 2 months. I was curious what the speakers tonight, and thank you for today, speaking to us today, think about the role of nonviolent civil resistance in preventing democratic backsliding.
I think nonviolent civil resistance can be really effective. I think it, can be one of the fundamental ways of waking people from the slumber. And so, I think, and there's social science evidence on behalf of the efficacy of nonviolent protest.
Not much more to say. Almost all of the cases where there was successful resistance to an elected autocrat involved large-scale protests. Now, there were some cases where large-scale protests like Nicaragua where it didn't work out because they smashed the protest movement, or Belarus, for example. Georgia is a case that's happening before us in real time right now. But it is a characteristic of successful resistance that people go out onto the streets at some point. So the United States is, has a complex tradition of civic protest. It's powerful in the American tradition around civil rights and many other issues. At the same time, we're a fairly big decentralized country. And so unlike some countries, national protest movements are more complex. They're more locally based, and often that's more effective because that gets people mobilized around an issue that they care about day to day or in a locality that they do. European friends of mine over the last 3 months have asked me again and again, how come I don't see big protests in, the mall in Washington? And I said, that's not the way to judge protest in the United States. You judge protest in the United States through a much more granular and complex lens that looks at how it's occurring all around the country and in different ways and over a longer period of time. We're not the kind of country that within 2 weeks produces a massive nationwide protest movement. So that a couple of reflections on that.
I would also add that up until this point, I think this administration in the United States has been quite smart at avoiding issues or backing away from issues that would likely lead to large-scale protests. And I think that the backing down this weekend on the tariffs against China are a great indication of that. In the sense of, being warned last week, it means empty shelves for Christmas. It means inflation. It means things that people really care about. So far, attacks on elite universities, law firms, the NSF, those are things that most people don't particularly care about. And so I do think that some of the things that you see happening now around the tariffs is really dramatic because we don't have high tariffs. We've backed down from every single threat of high tariffs. So I do think this administration has been quite smart in backing, including attacks on Medicaid and cuts on the welfare state. Those things are also not happening. So I think in terms of protest as a device right now, I think it's probably going to be very ineffective.
Although I'm not sure, Mary, if you're banging your head against the wall, stop banging your head it's smart, but you have to ask, why did you start banging your head against the wall?
I'm asking. I lost the. Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry, and then you.
Yeah, this is Augusto de la Torre. Often, I think most of the times, executive overreach is pre-announced. The candidate tells before, I want executive overreach. And they are elected, so they have a certain degree of popular authority to overreach. I would like you guys to give your opinion on something that I think is a fundamental difference. Some executive overreach results in strengthening of state capacities. Take, for instance, for all of their abuses, Fujimori created a very strong central bank, good fiscal institutions, strong regulatory powers. That type of executive overreach, once it is voted out, leaves a stronger state. Take the case of Lee Kuan Yew. Take the case of even Franco in the civil service in Spain. Then there are other types of executive overreach that destroy state capacities. Take the case of Correa in Ecuador. You weaken the prosecutorial capacity, the general attorney, the central bank, the regulatory agencies. To recover from that, it's a much difficult thing because the persistent effects are very large. So I'd like you to give an opinion on this distinction and how you detect one versus the other.
Great question.
Well, I completely agree with your observation and with the premise that state capacity is critical for developing deep democracy and for economic growth. To add to your list of autocrats or authoritarian-leaning presidents who strengthen state capacity, we could add certainly Alvaro Uribe in Colombia in some important respects. Many, many abuses, but also strengthened some aspects of state capacity. I think one of the indicators of which way you're leaning are pretty clear from a relatively early time. Do you do you gradually undermine the rule of law? Do you gradually, do you rule as a patrimonial leader? That is, you fuse your personal interests with state authority. I remember, this is maybe 10 years ago, that Fortune magazine listed Putin as the wealthiest person in the world, right? So these patrimonial style leaders rule to enhance their personal wealth, their power, the wealth of their friends. So I think you're absolutely right, but I don't think it's hard to make a judgment about which leaders on balance are strengthening state capacity and which ones are actually prefer to weaken it because it constrains them.
Nothing to add on that, yeah.
Great question. Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm here in my personal capacity, so I'll just be quick on this. Professor Mainwaring, one thing noted about the executive overreach happening in equal measure from the right and the left in Latin America, but in Europe it is true it's more a threat from the right. Seems to possibly also be the case here, and I wonder if it has to do with something related to presidential versus parliamentary systems, right? I mean, presidential systems are inherently perhaps more prone to executive overreach. And I just wondered if you had a thought on that. Latin America, of course, has a lot of presidential systems. The former Soviet Union does, some other regions, but Europe is predominated by parliamentary systems, which may be more effective at constraining, at least on the left, executive overreach. And there is a threat on the right from executive overreach in parliamentary systems in Europe, but the parliamentary systems seem to be able to manage this a little better, and at least temporarily. And I just wonder if you had any comparative experience between the level of presidentialism within a system and how that has an impact. I'm sure that's something you've looked at.
It's a good question. Tom Carothers might have a more informed answer than I. I mean, my instinct is that you're right but a key ingredient here is the party system, right? I mean, if you have a parliamentary system with a dominant, in which one party, the party of the prime minister, wins a decisive majority of seats, that can easily pave the road for executive overreach, right? And that was the story in Hungary. Likewise, under presidentialism, if the president's coalition has a decisive majority, that paves the way for executive overreach. I think that variable might be more important than the distinction between presidentialism and parliamentarism. Where presidentialism, I think, is an important consideration is the direct popular election of president. So most of these cases in Latin America, almost all of them, involved parties that were running for office for the first time ever. It's really unlikely that in a parliamentary system, a party that's running for the first time ever is going to get a majority. In the presidential systems, it's not the president necessarily, the president's party got a majority, but the president did with a sufficient congressional base to make it easy to continue to run things over.
Okay, so right here in next, the woman in the blue. And then I'm gonna, over here I have two people because I've totally neglected this side because of how I'm sitting. So go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for speaking. Van Cradle, former staff of USAID, one of those institutions presumably most people won't get up in arms about. I had a question because it seems like both the speakers spoke to the U.S.'s presumed economic strength and growth over the past number of years. And I think one important aspect that maybe has been missed in this conversation is the economic disparity and the growing economic disparity in the country. And I think some studies have pointed to over the years the importance of how economic disparity affects the erosion of, or is closely linked to the erosion of institutions, democratic institutions. And so I was interested to hear from the speakers about your perspective of, does there need to be some sort of correction in the economic disparity, which is the largest among high-income nations? Does there need to be a correction for there to be a democratic re-institutionalization, so bolstering of our democracies? And what would that look like for there to be, say, economic disparity correction where there's less disparity in the country? So thank you.
Well, I actually did speak to that issue, and I think it is important. I spoke to it, when I mentioned that a large part of the working class was left behind in the last, it's a long time, it's 50 years. Yes, I mean, I think that democratic robustness, democratic deepening is not the same, of course, and you're not suggesting it is, as economic opportunity, but when large parts of a population see that their economic opportunities are declining, that can easily generate disaffection. Two quick comments, further comments. One is that I think that Citizens United really tilted the United States in a direction in which we have not exactly a plutocracy, but it really enabled money to play a hugely important role in US democracy. And second, I think it wouldn't be difficult in principle to use the tax system to redistribute income much more than we do. And my own personal bias is that we should do that. In short, I think you're right. Generating a democracy in which people have enhanced opportunities, enhanced life opportunities, enhanced dignity, right? These are critical issues.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's true in some cases, but not in others. So you have to be careful about, again, a unified theory. Look at Israel. Israel is an economic miracle. The Israeli economy is astonishing. The wealth that has provided to Israelis in a very difficult regional context. Yet Israel's been on a path of democratic backsliding for the last 15 years. It's really striking. It's a lot more about national identity issues, the religious right, and the conception of what is Israel. Poland had one of the lowest levels of inequality in the world in the 2010s and a very successful economy. Poland's on track to outstrip Great Britain, by some projections in the foreseeable future in its GDP per capita. Bangladesh inequality was sinking in Bangladesh over the years in which it was going backward democratically. Bangladesh was a poster child of successful development practices and so forth. So in many cases, there are other issues than economic disparities. There are sociocultural agendas which are very divisive within countries, like, say, national identity issues. What kind of country is India? Is it a Hindu majoritarian country, or is it a secular liberal country? The Indian economy was doing pretty wonderfully in the early 2010s. Inequality was going down in India when Modi came to power. The people who voted for Modi were the winners, not the losers in many cases, and they wanted more. And so we have to be careful and think, if we just can tackle those levels of rising inequality or disparities, that's going to cure us of the virus of executive overreach. There are cases where it's very much the case, and the U.S. is an interesting one to discuss. But again, I'm just wary of one-size-fits-all answers to this phenomenon. Yeah.
Justin Kempf, hosted Democracy Paradox, a podcast for about 4 years. One of the major criticisms of American democracy in the past has been that it has too many veto points. We think of Francis Fukuyama calling America a vetocracy. We think of Levitsky in Ziblatt's most recent book talking about a tyranny of the minority. And yet it's those same veto points that are protecting democracy today during the Trump era. So my question is, provided that American democracy continues to survive and is resilient past this current populist epoch, do you feel that it will create the environment for substantive change that can make American democracy govern better? Or do you feel that we'll have a newfound respect for those checks that we have on executive power, political power within American democracy?
He used to run a really good podcast, Democracy Paradox. We miss your podcast. Wish you were still doing it. It's a really interesting question. I think that I'd say two things, Justin. One is that it could be that out of this moment comes some rethinking on the side of the Democratic Party about what it means to be an energetic, determined party that, quote, delivers for the people in ways with equal ferocity as the people on the other side. What that will translate to, I'm not really sure. But there is certainly a wake-up call about, Americans want leadership. They want decisive leadership, and they want clear agendas and that. But I think the vetocracy and the problem of sluggishness and calcification of American bureaucracy at the local, state, and national level is one that you could go after without taking apart the checks and balances in our system. I think, stopping shopping center from being built in an upper middle class neighborhood because people don't want a lot of riffraff hanging around the shopping center is a different check and balance than stopping a executive agency from stripping out inspector generals and not having internal controls and so forth. So we're going to have to be smart and not fall prey to simplistic ideas about we've proven that either all bureaucracy is good because it checks power or all bureaucracy is bad because it limits decisive action. That's going to call upon the Democratic Party and ideally the Republican parties that thinks these things through to be fairly sophisticated, because Americans want action on a lot of fronts, and they're getting it of different types, but they have, they voted for action. And that's why I think, it's caught a moment, the work by Ezra Klein and his colleague on abundance is, there's this sense of, hey, wait, Democrats need an action agenda. What is it?
Yeah, I completely agree with Tom's comment. Just one addendum, and that is that I thought the Levitsky-Ziblatt book, they're such smart scholars, but I thought it was way too blunt in how it handled vetoes, right, and minority rule. I mean, you absolutely, and they would agree with this, that you absolutely need some key kinds of veto mechanisms. Right? You want a system with a lot of checks and balances. That makes the system less vulnerable to erosion. Some of the instances of minority rule in the United States, however, I think are really bad. The Electoral College, it's a democratic abomination in principle, and it sometimes leads to electoral outcomes completely inconsistent with the majority opinion. But that's really hard to change. At present, it's just flat right impossible to change. So some of these mechanisms of minority rule are quite pernicious, but many are very salutary. And thinking carefully about which are which and whether and how you can change the ones that are pernicious, I think that's what we need to engage in.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask two people. So you go first and then in front.
Flavia Batista, I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Maryland. So my first question goes to Professor Scott. So when discussing Latin America, you mentioned that we had 4 executive takeovers. And I was wondering why you didn't include Bolsonaro. Was it because he didn't manage to completely take over democracy in Brazil? So I guess the general question that I'm asking here is, to what levels presidents have to undermine democracy for it to be considered executive takeover? And then the second question goes to Thomas. Why do you think Bolsonaro wasn't successful in his attempt to undermine democracy in Brazil? Was it because the judiciary wasn't strong enough to stop him? And I guess the general question here is, how can democracies fight back executive takeovers? Thank you so much.
And then the last question, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Kelly Curry with the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask a little bit about populism as a response to disaffection with the, I guess, what you would broadly call the neoliberal project that over the past 50 years has included a China-centric globalization, the financialization and tech shift in our economy, despite broad economic growth, some of the issues other people have raised. But then for me, the specific question is more about the rise of the managerial bureaucratic elites and executive overreach in that way. You could look at the EU as an example of this and how there's been a backlash against EU bureaucratization, and in the United States, COVID, again, as the response to COVID as an example of executive overreach, but not from the president himself, but from executives at all levels and from the unaccountable administrative state that has become so large and complex and invasive, and that in a way Trump is able to do what he's able to do through executive overreach because the administrative state is so large and pervasive. And so I guess it's more a question about state capacity and when it does become oppressive and when it does impinge here in the United States on our system of order and liberty, or in other contexts where it does make people in a democratic society feel disaffected from a political system that does not seem responsive to democratic impulses coming from the bottom up.
Very simple questions. On Brazil first?
Yeah, so I mean, the simple coding rule that I used, which is, if the varieties of democracy, electoral democracy score dips below 0.5. That's following the regimes of the world coding. And I'll give my own take on your second question about Brazil, which is I think the judiciary was really important in inhibiting Bolsonaro, and I think also the extreme fragmentation of the party system. So, Bolsonaro's party was an important party, but a tiny minority of both chambers of Congress. When he tried the coup in 2022, right? I mean, the rest of the Brazilian political right said, no, we're not concerned about it. And to the second question, just a brief comment. I mean, I think the question about regulation requires a lot of granularity in thinking. There are so many regulations that are key to our health, our environment. You can go down the list. And others that are excessively burdensome. So I don't want to give a blunt answer, oh yeah, we should deregulate or we should regulate more. I just think there's a tremendous amount of granularity that, you need very specific expertise. I thought that Ezra Klein's book and his recent, work on rethinking how Democrats govern at the local level, I think that's very interesting, very fruitful.
Tom, you have the last word.
Yeah, on Brazil, Bolsonaro was dealing from a fairly weak hand. He didn't have a majority party, and so he had fairly few arrows in his quiver. That's why he was mostly declarative illiberal, and then he lurched towards drastic measures out of desperation, kind of. And then Brazilian civil society was resolute in many ways. That's a big question on the administrative overreach. Americans they like administrative protection in their lives when they don't notice it. It's nice to buy a food and eat it and know that you're not going to get poisoned. That's good. When you take away those people who inspect the food, not so good. Actually, they like public health systems that ensure when you get injected with something, what you're getting injected with is what it says on the label. So there's a lot of forms of administrative protection in this country which are, prized and valued. But when it's like an iceberg, like COVID pokes above the surface of should we wear face masks or what was the instruction on children in schools, when it makes mistakes or goes too far or is controversial, then we decide, the problem is, administrative overreach and such. So we'll miss it. A lot of forms of administrative overreach as they're, canceled out in the months to come. And so I think we have to be careful about some of the narratives around what it is that has been stifling the system. It isn't food inspectors that have been stifling the system. And it isn't administrative overreach that caused the problems on the southern border, which were real and so forth. So I think we're in complex waters there, need to be careful about what the narratives are.
We're out of time. I want to thank both of you for really great opening remarks. Thank you so much.